Can start recording here. And once again, I'm going to formally welcome everyone to the Large Scale Scrum of New York City Meetup virtual webinar. Hosting here the well-known David Snowden, presenting and answering a variety of tough questions that have been collected for him since his last presentation a few weeks back. Should you have any additional questions for Dave, please just hold off until he finishes the questions he has prepared for, and I'm sure there will be time, and Dave will be able to take those. David, over to you.
Okay, so I got sent a list of questions and I restructured them into four sort of categories. One are questions to do with Agile. The other is one question to do with pseudoscientific cults. The third was questions about society, and the final one was theory. So I'll run through those in those sequence. But I'll probably pause after each group and give people a chance to ask more questions or respond. And I'm quite happy to have an argument. That's not a problem. Yeah. So the first one was there are plenty of discussion on what not to do. Don't use SAFe or Spotify. Don't use large consultancies. What approach should a large organization take for introducing and scaling Agile practice, particularly when Agile trained talent is scarce? Yeah. And then there was a second question. In the presentation, you advised not to fall for SAFe and Spotify. You warned about large consultancies, the ways of working, impact on companies and budgets. Do you see any relationship between large consultancies and the frameworks? Do you feel there's a cumulative impact on companies' forecasts for the next few years? These are both variations on the same thing. First of all, to correct the first one, I said don't use SAFe, and I said don't copy Spotify. That's very different. Okay? Basically, Spotify have lived a journey. And Spotify themselves say there's no such thing as a Spotify model. That's a contract. What you've got is, various times when people have talked with Spotify, they've said this is what they're currently doing. The fact is they lived a journey to get there. So one of the key principles of complexity is you can't start at the end point of somebody else's journey. You have to start at wherever you are and then use that as sort of information. But it's not a single framework or it's not a single model. So things like tribes may be appropriate for you or they may not. It depends on, there's no single context, no universal method. SAFe, as I said last time, is just, all they've done is bundle together everything that people want to buy and sold you some certification in it. The reality is the alternative, which is much more sensible, is to use different types of method in different combination. Right? And that's kind of like a multi-methods approach, and that's where a lot of us are going. It's one of the uses of the Cynefin framework. So, for example, and it's not the only way of doing it, but it's kind of like the way I've developed. So you can basically say Scrum as a technique is a liminal technique between complex and complicated. It's actually not very good at purely complex problems, but it's very good at making things which are ready to be complicated, to switch them out of the complex domain. Other techniques like time box have high value. They're actually complicated, nothing wrong with waterfall, etc. And there's a famous gaping void cartoon I use sometimes, which says if you want a carpenter to do good work, allow him to use his own tools. So nobody drives to work in the same color car. No software developer has exactly the same approach. You would need a degree of what we call coherent heterogeneity in the system. Okay? And Patty's come up with a good point there. It's a metaphor I use a lot. SAFe is a recipe, and recipes are parameters. Yeah, chefs understand the principles of cooking, and they've got what Aristotle calls Sophia and Phronesis, theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, and they've evolved it over time. So SAFe is perfect for the big consultancy firms. Now, one of the things to look at on the big consultancy firms is to look at what is the ratio between a principal and a doer. So that's between, say, a partner and a consultant. If the ratio is 1 to 5, maybe up to 1 to 10, maybe possibly 1 to 15, you've got an apprentice model. So basically, the person with the real knowledge has got apprentices, they're training them, they're interoperating, you've got a powerful framework. Once the ratio goes above 15, you've got an industrial model. And in an industrial model, you've got to feed a lot of people. You can't know them. 15 is a trust limit. Therefore, you get more and more structured process and you get more and more recipes. So the minute you get into those sort of ratios, you've got a problem. And the big consultancies want high utilization, long-term projects because their entire measure is utilization. Yeah, it's not value. And whatever they say, their real measure is utilization, and particularly bench utilization. So, yeah, if you look at it, the big consultancies grew on the back of Six Sigma, BPR, SAP, the other big ERP systems. What they like is a massive rollout with lots of people over a long period of time. What they don't like is small improvements in the present to nudge things in the right direction. So you're better working with small consultancies rather than big consultancies, would be the argument on that. Agile fluency model. I want to be nice here. I'm not quite sure whether Martin Fowler has fully endorsed it or not. That's an interesting question for me. I mean, he put it on his website. I think the first two stages are actually sensible. There's nothing to complain about that. Third stage is more dubious. The fourth stage indicates a lack of knowledge of complexity. I mean, they themselves admit that they can't understand it or define it properly. And I don't think, despite the video that they've produced, that they can avoid it being a maturity model. And I think maturity models are dangerous because they deprivilege people on earlier parts of the journey. The reality is, and this is a concept we've been talking about for the last 90 minutes, so apologies when we bring it in straight away, all of those different stages are continuously entangled one with the other, and they can't actually be separated. So I think it's, there's a famous phrase in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, mostly harmless. Right? So I put it in that category. There's some interesting things in it. It's not going to do any damage because you're never going to get beyond stage 2 anyway, and it's stage 3 and stage 4, which I would say would be dubious on that. Yeah. But yeah, I've debated that with Diane.
Can you bring me a spoon and a plate? Just a small spoon and a plate. You both of those burger.
I think somebody needs to mute themselves.
Small spoon.
Yeah, Ahmad Hassan, maybe it's you.
Yeah. Sorry, small spoon. I wouldn't mind a small spoon in a plate. There's something delicious on it. And then finally, Shakespeare famously wrote, "Don't kill off all the lawyers." With the Agile community, better off we did the same with all Agile trainers and their certifications, speaking metaphorically. I'm not sure I speak metaphorically. I mean, Agile has become a certification game. Right? Basically, you go on a 2-day course, you go on a 3-day course, you get a certificate, you get letters after your name. I've seen people with Agile CVs which got 15 sets of initials after their name, which is just farcical. I mean, I've got 3 I can put after mine, but they all came out of 2 or 3 year university courses, not out of turning up on a 2-day course or paying Dean to read his slides once a year, yeah, and $150 to renew, right? I think there's more money made on delivering training than there is on delivering code in Agile, and the balance is wrong there. Doesn't mean that we don't need to train. A few of us have been working on this. IT needs to become a profession. And a profession is not just attending a course and, you know, going through an open book exam over the next X weeks and ticking boxes and saying you're a master of something, right? That don't work. Apprentice schemes involve doing things with masters and journeymen over 2 or 3 years of reading, of understanding. It's that mixture of theory and practice. So we did try twice on a thing called Calm Alpha and Calm Beta, which we ran first in the UK and then in Denver, to try and get the Agile community interested in a proper professional development process, which would involve workbooks over 2 years, which would involve multiple courses that you did at various stages, which would involve some basic training in anthropology and ethnography. Yeah, and at the end of 3 to 4 years on that, you could actually call yourself certified. Yeah. So I'm not opposed to certification, but I am opposed to certification within a very trivial commercial model. It was interesting when DSDM was set up, which was an early predecessor. Yeah. Yeah. Great, thanks. Just put them on the bench. Yeah. That was set up originally. I was at the meeting. There were 3 companies came together. We were competitors. And because we were British, we met it for a dinner at a pub in Cheltenham rather than a ski resort, but that's a different sort of process. And we ended up agreeing to collaborate on the production of the GSDM method book. Now, the point is 3 competitors agreed to collaborate and they set up a separate company to run it. It wasn't one competitor or one person setting up their own company. It was designed to be collaborative across the community. So until we get rid of the sort of highly focused, highly narrow proprietary methods, and I use a slide sometimes to illustrate this. So if you look at canines in the wild, there are 3 or 4 variations and they're highly resilient. After 7 generations of domestication, you've now got 50,000 different types of dog, which are completely non-resilient and non-functional, but they all claim they're better than the other breed. Yeah, and agile needs to kind of like be rewilded, to use that phrase. It's become over-domesticated and over-fragmented. So those were the agile questions. Anybody want to throw anything else in? Anybody want to defend SAFE? I mean, Martin's not around anymore. Great loss, Martin, to the community.
Folks, unmute yourself, ask a question, and mute back again, if you don't mind.
I have a slightly different topic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm not sure if this was covered on the previous session because I wasn't there, but I believe that the large-scale Scrum framework is optimized for adaptability. I'm curious, do you believe a system can be optimized for any one thing? And how might you deduce what a system may or may not be optimized for?
I think large-scale Scrum basically takes a linear process that works very well in one context and tries to scale it by simply doing more of it at a wider level. And that's not how you scale a complex adaptive system. Yeah, so I mean, you know, you've got Scrum of Scrums, you've got large-scale Scrum, you've got all of those sort of things. I think they developed as an opposition to SAFE. I think the mistake made was to try and compete with SAFE rather than say that SAFE was wrong. And large-scale Scrum is that, right? So people want to scale this stuff. Okay, well, my method will scale by just doing it at different levels, and that's not the way you'll scale a complex system. Yeah. You scale by decomposition and recombination. Yeah.
Do you believe? So the other part of the question around optimization of systems or complex systems, are they optimized for any one thing? How might you deduce what the optimization or the purpose of the system might be?
I think the phrase optimization really goes with the phrase efficiency, right? So if you've got a highly ordered system where you can define the interactions and a model represents the system accurately, then you can focus on efficiency. Yeah. If you're in a complex adaptive system, you still optimize, but you focus on effectiveness, right? So you need to increase the amount of redundancy in the system, right? And complex systems degrade gracefully. They don't degrade catastrophically, whereas ordered systems degrade catastrophically. That's actually a robust resilience distinction, yeah? So there are only 3 things you can manage in a complex adaptive system. Constraints, catalysts, and energy allocation. And those are the only things you can manage. So that's what you do, right? I'll give you an example of a complex system technique on system design, because it will make the point. I think I gave it on the last seminar as well, which is the use of trios. So that's where we put a young, naive programmer together with an experienced systems architect, together with a user trained to talk to IT people, and tell them to produce prototypes of what they think the system would need. But we don't use one trio, we use 20 or 30 in parallel. That's a complex systems technique. Yeah, so I'm radically increasing the diversity of interaction at a much more finely grained level so that I can see what patterns are possible. The stuff which comes out of that would go into something like Scrum, because Scrum is a linear iteration. It accepts a degree of uncertainty, but not extreme uncertainty. Does that help or not?
Yeah, I guess the question I'm still uncertain about is, for a given system, is there a higher order purpose that system is striving to?
Okay. Right. Well, first of all, there ain't any higher order purposes in a complex adaptive system.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, you need to be purposeful, but not have purposes.
So if you took like, I don't know if this is a good example, but like a human, we don't have a, if we're a complex adaptive system, we don't have a purpose, or like
we occasionally have short-term goals, but nobody maps out their entire lifespan. We respond to what happens. And I mean, the other key thing, and people just don't get this, but it's vital, right? Fundamentally, complex systems are defined by how things connect, not by the things. Now, the minute you understand that, and that's 101 that's 101 cognitive science as well as 101 complexity science, then all this stuff about changing people and common objectives and common goals just goes out the window. It's bugger all to do with complexity. If anything, it perverts the system. The way you manage a complex system is you manage the evolutionary potential of the present. So you need a sense of direction, but not specific goals. And to some extent, this is kind of like the next generation of systems architecture as well. This is the work we're doing with scaffolding. So it's all very well if you're building, let's take Glenn's lovely concept here. You know, we bend metal and it has to be right first time. So I've been dealing with a Twitter troll on this. Some of you will know about it, right? So this is a guy who does systems testing on massive NASA type programs. Well, yeah, I mean, you know exactly what you've got to achieve. It's defined well in advance. You can do all the stuff on that. But look at the stuff we're doing in terms of COVID, in terms of managing lockdown. We got no idea what the end point is. We're exploring possibilities in the present. So a modern systems architecture would have variable types of scaffolding with various types of interaction definition so that systems can evolve, not just by design. So you put the design into the scaffolding and the interactions, and then the systems evolve in practice. I mean, that's kind of like a 2-day course. So I'm summarizing it in a key phrase, but that's one of the key differences. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm not so sure on LESS. I think there's a lot of retrospective coherence going on. I think LESS and DAD, you know, and SAFE, they all emerged around the same time. And I think all of them worked off a complicated, ordered ontology rather than the complex ontology. LESS is a lot better than SAFE because it leaves far more options open to people. Right? But it also only works within a limited set of constraints, and within that it will work very well, would be the general judgment. Okay, so moving on, pseudoscience and cults. Somebody said, what's your view on the evolution model of the spiral dynamics, Claire Graves, Don Beck stuff, yeah? Is the business world society model ever to become teal? All right, this is one of the 2 worst books ever published in the Agile movement. Yeah, the other one, yeah, is, oh God, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. I've been trying to knock it out of my head for a long time. Is Lean Startup. So Lean Startup and Reinventing the Organizations are both achieved cult-like figures. They're both based on completely inaccurate use of cases. So Lean Startup goes and studies a bunch of successful companies, identifies things they did in common, and says, if you do these things, you too will be successful. He didn't study the companies who failed. We did that when I was in IBM with Dorothy Leonard at Harvard. And we found all the companies who failed did exactly the same things as the companies who succeeded. What you've got is a market with a huge amount of entrepreneurs, so some are bound to succeed. Right? So it's not that the advice is necessarily bad, but it's not got a causal relationship. Right? The second, but the worst one, is Reinventing the Organization.
What are you looking for?
Sorry, somebody else wasn't muted. Right? So Reinventing the Organization is even worse because there you've got a guy with a religious ideology who only reports the aspects of the cases which support the ideology. We got some unmuted ones, yeah? So, for example, it kind of like reports on, you know, the use of holacracy at Zappos and kind of like casually mentions, but doesn't really emphasize the huge amount of people who are fired. It reports on self-organizing communities, but every single one it does was draconianly imposed by a centralized manager. It didn't emerge naturally. So it's highly selective in the cases. It also is involved in this evolutionary model. So I feel really sorry for Claire Graves. Spiral dynamics originally evolved as an explanation of how societies progress. If you go back to the original theory, and it's a very Western, liberal, culturally specific view of historical progress. Okay, it's neo-colonial in its nature. So if you buy into that particular view of history, it's a very good description of history. It talks about the stages you go through. You can't take a framework designed to handle large movements in history and apply it to individuals or organizations. It doesn't move across. Yeah? It also has this implication that the higher levels are better than the lower levels. I remember having an argument about this with Beck at a conference, and I remember him saying, well, you don't understand my arguments because I'm turquoise and you're just an angry blue or an angry green or something. It's a classic, I'm in the elite, therefore I don't have to account for myself. That's how cults work. Yeah, Wilbur is particularly bad at this. Yeah, it doesn't tolerate dissent. And I remember having badges made which had proud to be brown on them. And the next day I got accused of, why are you doing this? Brown isn't a spiral dynamics color. And I said, well, that's exactly the point. Yeah? The idea you go through this linear progression is just a very bad framework, right? And self-organization is something which only happens within constraints, and it's only appropriate in certain contexts. Right? It's not a universal goal or an achievement. And I don't know of any of the examples quoted in that book where you couldn't tear his conclusions apart if you did just 2 days of ethnography in the organizations. Yeah, the cases do not back up the theory practiced, yeah, in that sense. Yeah. And I'll make this general point, and sorry to people in the Kanban movement and everything else. Hierarchical models of maturity are very dangerous in a complex system because they instantiate past practice. They don't actually enable new practice. And they focus people on achieving what was retrospectively seen to be good, rather than what may be good in a more uncertain future. Yeah, so they only work in an ordered system. Questions on society. What systematic change can you predict in the ways of working in the decade of 2020s after agile delivery? Yeah. The one thing you can say is that there will be more fads. It's kind of like there seems to be this desire for some sort of universal recipe to come out every 2 or 3 years, which everybody picks up on. I think what some of us are hoping is that complexity, rather like systems thinking replaced scientific management in the 80s, we can see some evidence that complexity is now replacing systems thinking. And by the way, I had the great privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker on a series of executive seminars. And one of the things we agreed on is that complexity theory and scientific management have a lot in common, and they both disagree with systems thinking. People condemn scientific management, but actually it empowered human beings to use their judgment. Scientific management automated what could be automated, but then it looked at apprentice models and lifetime employment for managers and supervisors because it recognized the need for human judgment. What systems thinking has been consistently trying to do since the 80s is to actually remove human judgment and reduce it to a series of spreadsheets and processes. And that, by the way, is the disastrous aspect of holacracy. I mean, holacracy is a program written by somebody who doesn't want the responsibility of making management decisions. And if you ever saw the need for management decisions go into the current crisis, there's a point where you have to do things differently. Yeah. So in terms of predicting what will happen, I'm not sure. I mean, I think virtual working has become easier, but it's also creating more stress. So for example, if you spend too much time in Zoom, you're getting visual stimulation, but the brain and the body aren't picking up chemical signals, which they normally expect in a physical meeting. So the stress levels go up. So we're not, I think, you know, we can change things. We'll probably fly less. I think the French initiative is brilliant to say that they'll subsidize the airlines, but only if they don't fly short haul, because there are trains which do that more effectively. So this is a chance to do something for the planet. But I think it's going to be a melange of different things, yeah, as we come through. I think the attempt to move software development methods into business practice is doomed to fail. It will work for marketing and HR, which have short life cycle projects. But the idea you can use agile methods in strategy could only be devised by somebody who's never been in corporate strategy. And I've yet to find any of the people who advocated who spent any time in corporate strategy whatsoever, which is deeply political in its nature. It's not a short cycle like method development. And there was a really bad paper which came out lately which said all the big tech giants were agile, therefore they'd succeeded, whereas the other guys weren't agile, so they'd failed. And that's another example of retrospective coherence. The reality is the big tech giants were the first into their markets. So they were apex predators. And the apex predator survives no matter how incompetent they are until the market conditions shift again. So there are massive inefficiencies in Amazon, in Apple, in Microsoft. It's just they dominate their spaces, so you don't notice the inefficiencies. And this habit of trying to fit success into whatever your favorite framework is has got to stop. If somebody adopted Agile consciously and then reported success, I believe it. But saying this company was successful and I can re-describe them as if they were Agile, that's snake oil salesman. So I don't buy that. Technical data file civilization, we're not going to do it without at least partial extinction. I mean, get real on this, all right? Global warming is serious, and the major economic power in the world isn't taking it seriously. And there's no way, I mean, COVID is just minor compared with what's probably going to come in my lifetime. I used to worry about my grandchildren, now I'm worried about my children, now I'm worried about me, and I'm 66, But we're going to see catastrophic failures of the ecosystem, which will make COVID seem like what it actually is, which is a chance to get it right for the worst thing coming. And I think that's what we've got to prepare for, to be honest. I mean, we'll survive as a species, but what survives becomes key. So the technical debt is going to be recovered catastrophically. Doesn't mean that something good can't come out of it, but COVID-19, I said the other day on a seminar that it's kind of like, if I want to get religious, it's a gift of God. It's a chance, it's a wake-up call. It's a chance to get things right. I mean, it's actually quite nice. My house, I can see my house from the planes, or used to be able to when I flew back from the States early in the morning. If I was on the left-hand side of the plane, I could look out the window and see my house on a clear day. There's been no contrails for 6 weeks, and the air is clean, right? So I think there are genuine opportunities here, but you can also see the government's using things in abuse. So one of the big things which is happening in the UK at the moment, which is really worrying us, is they're moving to a centralized database on contact tracing. Now, anybody who knows anything about IT knows that that's a Black Mirror scenario. You actually need a distributed database. But if I want to actually go out, I'll probably have to download the app. So you've got a level of compulsion there. Secondly, they're outsourcing the contact tracing to a commercial company, not to the police or a state institution. Now that's a classic dictatorship ploy, because if you deploy it, say, to the police have independence from government. If you deploy it to a commercial company, then the commercial company only has loyalty to you. Right? And you can see that being seized left, right, and centre within the NHS in the UK, and the US has been going that way for a long time. So I think one of the duties of all of us in IT, who are, we know what can happen with centralized databases, and we're not fooled by people who say they can't be hacked or abused, because we actually know how to do that. So it's down to us to start to speak out about this and speak different sort of problems. And very sorry, if you ask questions about society, you can get a political lecture. And if you don't like a political lecture, then retreat into a cave somewhere and wait for Trump to rule the universe. IT people need to be engaged in politics pretty damn fast, and trying not to be involved in politics is actually to take a political position. You need to understand that. It's like people who say they can separate religion and politics. You can't. Actually, everything is intertwined when it deals with people. Fundamental shift in organizational design. I think if it works, communication will become interaction. I mean, we're advocating that strongly at the moment. You don't communicate by sending messages out. You communicate by engaging people in finding solutions and telling you about the problem. So, for example, we're deploying learning journals into health systems at the moment. Yeah, because what we actually need is for learning to take place in real time during the crisis. Retrospective won't work. But they were engaging the journal keepers in micro scenario planning and multicultural situational assessment. So the communication is done by engagement, not by one-way information flow. So I think that's one of the key things. The second thing is, I think we're going to go to more modular or networked organizational structures. Yeah. One of the issues we got with that, and very sorry, but this is another political point, is things like minimum wage and minimal survivability. Because the networked economy with thousands and thousands of independent consultants is being shattered by the current crisis. So you're not going to be able to achieve lockdown if people don't have enough money to actually buy food. And that's a state issue, not an individual issue. So I think the balance between the state and commercial companies is going to change, but exactly how I don't know. So I think I've answered the society questions, yeah? In terms of theory, I've already made this point. So you don't scale a complex system by aggregation or imitation, but by decomposition and recombination. If you think about it, DNA, 4 different chemical compounds combine in different ways to create the huge complexity of organic life form. So the way you actually scale a complex adaptive system, and this has been one of my main objections to SAFE, is that it's theoretically wrong as well as practically wrong, because you can't scale by aggregation. What you do is you scale down to the lowest level of coherence you can manage, and you allow the new things to interact in novel ways, and you see what patterns emerge from the interaction. So that's kind of like the multi-method approach. You create scaffolding around which things can interact, but then you allow the form to be novel as it actually develops, and that's an example of scaling. So sorry, I've gone through all of that fairly quickly. Well, actually 40 minutes, yeah. Just looking at the questions now.
Dave, there shouldn't be a problem. So at least there's at least one question that is in the queue. In fact, I'll let the person who submitted it late make it vocal, and I'm sure there will be others.
I can talk to it if you like. Hi Dave, hi Jean.
Hey, John.
So just curious about direction of travel, where a direction of travel finishes and where a goal starts. Because I'm kind of getting the sense in complexity theory that you kind of respond to what's going on right now, that you don't kind of plan for the future so much. But where is the limit to that? I mean, do we just react to what happens every single day, or is there some kind of a limit to what that direction of travel will be?
What you do is you map what are called the adjacent possibles. Right, so we do a lot of this work, right? So you need to find the stepping stone from where you are, which you would like to move on to, and then see what stepping stones become revealed as a result. Yeah, so that's the point about having a sense of direction. If you have a goal in a complex system, everything is changing. Everything you do changes the system. And the problem with goal-based achievement in a complex system is it produces perverse results. So I can send you a paper on this if you want, which is a meta-study.
Yeah. Which
basically, this is New Scientist, I think it's April 2015, I'm not sure. Yeah, whenever people are working for extrinsic goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. There is no evidence to contradict that. And where do we have the highest level of extrinsic goals? Health, education, social services. Where do we need the highest level of intrinsic motivation? The same 3. Yeah. So the minute you have goals, and this is also Goodhart's law, when people, if the minute you make a measure a target, it ceases to be a measure. Yeah. So if you have goals, people focus on goal achievement, not on the things the goals are meant to measure. And one of the ways that systems thinking try to manage uncertainty, and this includes things like Peter Senge with learning organization, as well as things like PPR, is they try to manage uncertainty by saying where they wanted people to be. And that created a whole movement where goal achievement was more important. So you can see a consequences of that. For example, in IBM, we had what we used to call target hoppers. So they would move in, manage a business unit for a year or 18 months, achieve the targets regardless of the cost to people or the long-term organization, and then move on. And they were rewarded.
Yeah, and which on the target's been abused and being very careful about that. It's just like
they always will be.
How far would you do any forecasting at all? Is kind of what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, there's forecasting, backcasting, and sidecasting.
Right.
So forecasting is where you project the present onto the future, and that works where you have a high level of constraints, so you've got predictability.
Yeah.
There's backcasting, which is a way of imagining future possibilities and see if you can remove the blockages. That's a social science method, but it also links in with Goldratt's use of the idea of constraints. Yeah. You remove the constraints and see what happens. Yeah. And then there's sidecasting, which is my phrase, all right, where you cast around in the present to see what you can actually do next, and you choose what you think is the best direction. And then you choose again, and then you choose again. Right? So you have a general sense, and the other big thing here, which we do a lot with companies at the moment, is to define what we don't want to be rather than define what we do want to be.
Yeah.
So it's actually quite easy to get consensus on what we don't want to be, and that actually restricts options, but it leaves options open so we can explore different possibilities. And it's actually how we train our children. All fairy stories are stories of failure, not success.
Just the other side of that, though, I was thinking about, you were saying that a couple of weeks ago, and you hear people saying, don't think of the red elephant, and you think of the red elephant. So how do you deal with that situation where, okay, these are the things that we need to avoid, but you don't want to kind of reinforce people going there unknowingly as well, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I think, well, first of all, part of the reason that we tell people fairy stories is that they don't do stupid things like going into the woods on their own without something to beat off wolves, all right?
Yeah.
So negative stories and the human brain pours more attention to them than it pays to positive stories. Yeah. So negativity is a way that human beings have developed so that the next generation can learn from what failed in the previous direction, not what succeeded. Okay. And actually, ethically, that's more valuable. So learning from other people's failure, but exploring new possibilities is both ethically better and in resilience terms, I think, better. Yeah. And added to which, you've got this ontological impossibility. A complex system doesn't have linear relationships between cause and effect, so goals are bound to be wrong. So why set things that you know are going to be wrong up front? We developed something called a vector measure. So vectors measure direction and speed of travel for energy consumption from the present. Yeah, so we use that, for example, with nurses, with teachers. So a vector measures, am I going in the right direction at the right speed without consuming too much energy? It doesn't say, have I achieved a goal, but it can still be a KPI.
I got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Thank you for the question, John. Sorry, I'm mute.
Now you are on mute.
Yeah.
I am on mute. I'm sorry. There was one question that was submitted before the event.
Yeah, from Greg, the three horizon stuff. I think sidecasting is casting around the present for multiple possibilities, and it's only looking short term. If you can look medium or long term, you've probably got a level of constraint and order. Or you can do what we're currently doing with something which you can all participate if you want, which is post-pandemic micro-scenario planning. So we're using thousands of people from different backgrounds to generate scenarios about the future. And then we're looking for patterns in thousands of culturally, experientially diverse agents to see which future pathways are coherent and which aren't. So forecasting in a complex world is identifying which pathways are coherent. And for that, you need mass sensors, mass human sensors with different backgrounds. You can't do it with a single sensor. It's why scenario planning is actually quite deficient, because it's a culturally limited group of people doing a forces and factors analysis, generating 5 stories, and it doesn't take place in real time. We can use thousands of people in real time to assess a situation and create scenarios. And we can use fitness landscapes to identify which scenarios have coherence, and then critically, which scenarios are outlier scenarios. There's enough people who think they'll happen. Yeah, this is what we call finding the 17%, which is a reference to the famous experiment in which radiologists didn't see a gorilla in plain sight. Or at least 83% didn't, but 17% did. So you want to find the 17% before they talk to the 83% and they think they were wrong. So that's, complex adaptive systems are about real-time generation of multi-perspective data in order to identify the direction forward. And that's one of the things IT and HR are in a position to do, because they actually own the networks. So the ability to deploy the whole of your workforce, as a human sensor network in real time becomes a key skill in the next generation. In fact, your workforce are wiser than your consultants. And the data you can get from them is more objective.
Dave, for this, I'm not sure why
I'm trying to read a long one at the moment from Jim Carp. Oh, that's to me privately. All right.
Yeah.
So,
Jim, do you want to ask it publicly, or is somebody else want to ask it publicly?
Sure. I'll try and be brief. My apologies for the length. But you've told us about all the negative models, all the things we shouldn't be doing, and yet there's a practical need to coordinate the activities of people. Your skill set is very rare to be able to entice and nudge. What would you say is the best approach we should take to coordinating the activities of large numbers of human beings to accomplish goals? We do it all the time, right?
Go and run a bunch of parties for teenagers and then apply the lessons learned to your company. We're actually all very good at managing uncertainty because we do it with our children and friends. We just forget it when we get to work. Yeah, so you manage the boundary conditions, you manage the amplification strategy, you manage the catalytic moments to see what emerges. We all know how to do this, right? So for example, one of the things we're doing on Crisis Manager at the moment is you have to delegate decision making. So the key thing in a crisis is the center coordinates, the periphery makes decisions. Now, if you talk to some agile evangelists, they say that means you allow people to self-organize. Well, actually it doesn't. Yeah, if people are allowed to self-organize without constraints, they just work with people they like to work with insufficient diversity. So one of the things we do, for example, is say anybody can make any decision provided two other people from radically different backgrounds sign it off and make it visible. And what I'm doing is, so for example, a doctor can make a triage decision provided a nurse and an administrator with at least 10 years experience sign it off. So what I'm building is a process, which means I can trust it. The big one in humans are crews. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, if you go to the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, they never talk about making themselves above average. The sort of classic. I always get amused by this. Agile HR people who say we're going to make everybody above average, which rather indicates their school didn't teach them basic mathematics, right? Fundamentally, what the Army and Navy do is they take people in who are below average and they make them above average through process. And that's what we need to think about. So crews are key. People are trained in role and role interaction, the same with an operating theatre. So if people are in a crew, you can delegate to the crew because you know the role, it's the interactions between the roles which are making decisions, not the individuals. And there's a validation check. So the key thing on trust is to build trust into the process. Yeah? The other thing to remember is we evolved to work in extended families and clans. Yeah, that's the classic 5, 15, 150. Yeah, so in Kinevin terms, crisis management teams less than 5. Complex teams less than 15 because of the level of trust. Expert teams less than 150 because you've got to know something about people. Only in the highly structured state can you afford for organizational units bigger than about 100. Yeah, people use Dunbar's number wrongly. They forget people have families as well. Yeah, so assume you've got about half the available number. So that would be kind of like some of the stuff on that. Yeah. And I think the key, I'll come back to this key point. The way you manage uncertainty is you define interactions, not goals. So again, think about teenagers, all right? When your kids hit puberty, the thing you most worry about is the friends they've got. Because when they hit puberty, the inhibition circuits on the brain redissolve and then they reconnect based on interactions. And they stop looking up to you. In fact, you become the enemy and their friends become the people they look to as a peer group. So who their friends are will form them for the rest of their lives. Yeah? It's interactions which matter, yeah, not people in that sense. Yeah. And yeah, to Barbara, the hero methodology is an absolute nightmare. It's quite interesting. We did a lot of work on counter-narco work in Mexico and Colombia. And our big problem is we were working with American consultants. Now, this is not an anti-American comment. America is a different culture. People chose to become Americans. So America is actually ethnically diverse, but culturally pretty monotone. So it's kind of like currently divided into 2 or 3 tribes, yeah, but it's still thing. America has this very strong concept of idealizing a future state and having great leaders lead us to it, because that's how America was formed. When we look at narratives in Mexico and Colombia, there are no narratives of the future. The narratives are always of the past and the present. And there are no male heroes. The only hero archetype in the stories in Mexico and Colombia were young single females with children, because it turns out the drug barons don't consider them targets. And we had American consultants, transmedia consultants, who wanted to create telenovelas of male superheroes beating up the drug barons and giving people a vision of a future drug-free state. Now, in the projects in New York, that would probably work. In the slums of Mexico City, it would have the opposite effect. So this question of context is very important. And the hero mythology is particular to states which are actually colonially aggressive. Right? Now I've lived next door to the English, so I'm allowed to say this, all right? But basically America, like England before it, like Rome before it, is an empire. But it's an empire which seeks to make people like itself. Yeah, American exceptionalism has grown on English exceptionalism, which grew on Roman exceptionalism. And the empires fail when they suddenly realize the rest of the world doesn't want to be like them. So for the Romans, it's various, where are my eagles? And by the way, the work which did this was commissioned by John Poindexter, one of the best projects I did for it. Yeah. With the English, it's the Indian Mutiny. It hasn't happened to America yet. The Chinese emperor, on the other hand, is very different. And actually, China is going to come out of COVID stronger than America. Because America has lost its leadership, deliberately abandoned its leadership, European countries will hedge their bets with China. You can see that happening now. And China commands most of the natural resources of the world, because they've created relationships in Africa and Latin America, which are based on helping people, not on cultural stimulation. And the way the Chinese empire works is they let the barbarians conquer them, then they make them Chinese. And that's actually what China's done with capitalism. It's made capitalism Chinese. Okay? But what China does, it acts as an attractor. It doesn't act as a conqueror. Okay? And I think that sort of network model actually becomes more interesting. And the Starbucks mug collection is very impressive. You're only seeing 20% of it. It goes around the other 2 walls and on the bookcase on the other side.
But Dave, doesn't the hero model also give organizations a false sense of accomplishment in some ways? Yeah,
and I think the leadership model also encourages narcissism, because the leader can't fail. The minute you create a leadership myth, the leader isn't allowed to fail. Yeah, and that's deeply problematic. The interesting thing, about crews is you can fail in a crew. So there's a fascinating study done by Carl Weick. He didn't recognize the context though, so it's called high reliability organizations. And he identifies organizations which actually have a high ability to confess failure. And for anybody who's been, like you and I have been in knowledge management all our lives, Barbara, we know the ability to confess failure is the biggest sign of a healthy knowledge organization. What he forgot is that all the people he studied were crews. And it's not the individual confessing failure, it's the role. And he never forgave me for saying at one conference that I could get the same behavioral characteristics of firefighters if I burnt the office down every day, but that wasn't an acceptable organizational intervention. But that's British debating standards, and it doesn't often go down well with Americans. Yeah? But I think that's the key point, all right? You need systems in which failure is hard baked into the processes, not dependent on individual qualities. And HR departments have got to realize that changing people is a waste of time and not ethical. Yeah, whereas changing how people interact changes people a lot faster. And to go back to Patty, well, the Irish saved the world, yeah, from barbarianism after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But I would point out that your patron saint is Welsh.
So a quick question: if you talked about not having goals, how do you determine what a failure is? In context to what?
It's fairly easy to identify when it happens. Yeah, it's very difficult to predict, right? I mean, you can make some failures, all right, predictable, but a lot of failures you realize at the time or retrospectively, and you learn from it.
Is that but that's usually in, like, I guess, traditional thinking in relation to achievement of some goal. We were trying to do X, we didn't get to X, therefore we failed. But what?
No, well, I think that's a strong way of looking at it. I think it's more prosaic than that. So, at some stage in our life, I assume everybody in his organization has failed to back up a computer system, and they've never made that mistake again. Right? There are some things until you fail, you don't learn. It's actually why the apprentice model built that into it. Yeah. The problem with power, right, is if you're powerful, you can't be a change agent because you're locked into the previous power paradigm. Yeah? The issue is to change the dispositional state so a different model works, and that's actually easier. I mean, you need to be, in ecological terms, if the apex predator is there, you can't disrupt them, but you can become a keystone species and you can make their environment uninhabitable. I'll leave that one for you to think about a bit. Yeah. And servant leadership is simply saying the opposite. This is a classic technique, all right? It's kind of like, we don't like this, so we'll swing the pendulum, right? There's a time to be a servant leader. There's a time to be a coordinator. There's a time to be a dictator. Yeah, good leaders know how to adopt radically different styles in different contexts. There isn't a single model of leadership. All leadership is contextual. And I remember Steve Denning trying to, when he wrote a book called Radical Leadership, he tried to get the CEO of GC and the CEO of Apple into the same category and said they did the same things. Now, I knew both of them, all right? They were radically different. They did totally different things. They had nothing in common. Yeah? There is no recipe for leadership. Leadership is contextual.
Hey, Dave, everyone, we got 2 minutes before we have to wrap, folks. I think we are not going to take any more questions because they need to drop off, I think, unless you have some extra time.
I have a question, extra question. It's in regards to resource allocation and prioritization. So let's say if you're in a system, it's not chaotic system yet, could be, I don't know, but it could be a complex system. That's a good place to start. And we are trying to prioritize our, let's say, a product backlog or something like that. From a prioritization and resource allocation point of view, what would you say would the best strategy would be in terms of allocating your dev team resources on items which can fall potentially in simple and complex and also complicated?
The more you actually waste time and resource at the definition phase, the faster you actually deliver. Right? Part of the problem with backlog is it's over-defined. Part of the problem with things like story points is that they're abstracted from real user experience. Yeah. So methods I mentioned like trios or 888, yeah, or unarticulated need mapping are designed to prevent premature convergence on a backlog. All right. If you've got a backlog, you may have missed opportunities. Yeah. Empowerment then, I think, is also a granularity issue. And I would say too many agile teams are focusing on clearing the backlog rather than delivering value. They confuse the two. It was actually satirized in the last series of Silicon Valley, where he actually clears the entire backlog in one 48-hour stint. And I've seen agile people see him as a hero and not realize it's a satire. Yeah. We don't involve, we tend to take, even agile tends to take a reductionist approach to requirements capture because it wants to reduce it to define story points or backlog that you can clear. It doesn't do the system as a whole. And I think the other big problem we got at the moment is when I was programming, I'd actually been a financial controller for 4 years who also could program. So when I wrote financial decision support systems, I knew the field. Right? Now we've got this separation. Programmers don't know the field anymore. And therefore they're entirely reliant on upfront definition. And we need to start to change the design process. That's the thing we're doing with trios. So we train users to talk to IT people. It's actually fairly easy to train users to talk to IT people. It's almost impossible to train IT people to understand users. Particularly being as they all think they understand them anyway, right? When actually they don't. So you start to have small combinations of transdisciplinary teams working at a definition phase, holding possibilities open for as long as possible. And then you consolidate at different levels of granularity. So some things will go into Scrum. Some things can go into time boxes. Time boxes are much neglected in the Agile movement, and they're still a brilliant technique. Yeah, and some stuff will go into waterfall, because you know exactly what you've got to deliver. Again, that comes back to where we started. What you actually want is multiple methods. Yeah. And yeah, customer problems is written as source. Well, your other problem is we can write down 10% of what we know. Now, just think about that. We can write down 10% of what we know. And every time somebody abstracts something which is written, they lose another 40 to 50%.
Yeah. Hey, Dave, I think we need to wrap. I'm trying to be conscious of your time as well. So hopefully, folks, thank you. No more questions will be taken. I want to express my personal gratitude. Thank you for doing this, Dave.
My pleasure.
Any additional assets you want to share with the folks, just forward them to me. Just
Yeah,
like
we'll do.
last time, yeah. And I think someone asked for a reference material, and we'll just circulate it accordingly. Everyone else, thank you for joining, and hopefully Dave was able to answer some of your pressing questions. I'm sure it was very entertaining for many and informative, of course.
I have a quick request. I thought it was fantastic. And the request is basically, I have more questions now than I began with, which is a good thing. But if you have suggested reading or another form of interaction, it would be great to...
I'm about to update the list on the website. One of the things I've been doing, I've discovered I'm not the only one, it's a concept of confinement, is I've actually, for the first time in 25 years, got all my academic books organized in subject areas on shelves. Yeah? And I'm now happily scanning them in. And I've made the library public. Right?
Excellent.
But it also means I'm going to update the recommended reading. But most stuff in complexity is in papers, not books. Yeah.
Dave, thank you very much. I would like kind of to ask one thing. Can we make this more regular? Because it's such a pleasure to listen to everything you have mentioned, even political things. I would love to see you as often as possible.
Yeah. Well,
always happy to have a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll chat. Maybe we can invite you again.
Yes. Okay. Always around. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you all, folks. Before we start seeing people dropping like flies, I'm going to thank you all for joining. And once again, David, to you personally, a lot of appreciation for doing this. Okay.
Pleasure. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.
Dave. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Dave.
Bye.